let's make a start. Welcome everybody. I'm Rebecca Bailey, Programme Director of Towards the National Collection, and you've joined the second of a series of 3 webinars about our foundation projects. Half the projects are completely finished and reported, half are tidying up and finishing at the moment and preparing their reports. But we've pulled together the series of webinars, not so much to go back over everything the projects have done, because many of you will have attended their own webinars or earlier sessions that we've run, but more to concentrate looking across the projects on what they found out through their research, and particularly any recommendations they have for us going forward. Obviously, their recommendations join everything from the commissioned research that's been undertaken and will be undertaken, and from our discovery projects, which started at the end of last year and are running for 3 years. So what you're hearing today is an important part of the picture. It's where we all started, and it feeds into those overall recommendations. The first webinar, and I can see some familiar names, thank you for your loyalty and coming back, was on Tuesday. And the third, there's going to be a bit of a delay, and we're going to have the third on the 8th of July, where we'll be hearing from engaging crowds and locating a national collection. And for those of you who hoped to see persistent identifiers on Tuesday, but unfortunately the speaker was ill, we hope we're going to be able to reschedule her for the 8th of July, but we haven't been able to confirm that yet. So the order of play today is we're going to hear first from Joe Padfield at the National Galleries talking about IIIF. Then we're going to go over to the V&A. It's a very glamorous day today. The V&A to Natalie Kane to talk about Born Digital. And then finally to the National Archives to Lora Angelova to talk about deep discoveries. We're going to do all the presentations back to back, but if you have questions, please register them in the chat as people are speaking, and we'll pick them up in the Q&A. So we'll do a joint Q&A at the end. Each of the speakers have got 20 minutes. We're going to try and keep them fairly close to that so that there are time for questions at the end. So Joe, if you're ready, please take over the screen.
Sorry, in sharing the screen, it then hid where I was supposed to turn my microphone back on. Good afternoon. My name is Joe Padfield. I am the Principal Investigator on the Practical Applications of IIIF. It's a building block towards a digital national collection, one of the foundation projects, as Rebecca has just said, of the Towards the National Collection programme. So today I will be commenting on some of the things we've done in the project, noting, as Rebecca's commented on, as how that relates to recommendations, but our project just finished on Friday, and we are still collating all of the recommendations for the project. So there'll be more information in the final report once it is completed. Now, to begin with, there's the assumption that everyone understands or knows what IIIF is now, but it stands for the International Image Interoperability Framework. And on their website, it's a set of open standards for delivering high quality attributed digital objects online at scale. It's also an international community developing and implementing IIIF and supporting it. And it's backed up by a large consortium, growing consortium of leading cultural institutions. But what does that mean in practice? Now, if we're looking at a national collection or similar large scale infrastructure type system, we have a number of institutions that might be sharing information with this national collection. Now, in a non-IIIF environment, that can be done through a variation or somewhere in between these two options. An institution will publish data, and that will include metadata and images, which then need to be ingested by whatever a national digital collection was. There's also the more traditional approach of an institution exporting an Excel spreadsheet and posting a hard disk to the National Collection Office to provide digital images and content. Now, that then means that the National Collection needs to care about all of this information. They need to care about what data is published, what metadata formats are being used, what image formats are being used, and how they actually ingest this for each of the individual institutions. Now, with IIIF, what happens is an institution publishes their image metadata and image information following the standard, the IIIF standard. And that means the National Gallery collection, or sorry, the National Collection, just needs to care about the IIIF standard and ingesting the metadata. Okay, so the images themselves will stay with the host institution and be published directly from them. So there's a connection maintained between the presentations that a National Collection might give and the institution offering those images in the first place. And the IIIF system is supported by a range of well-structured open tools and servers. So there's a lot of sort of tools to use. Now, obviously, the complication increases with scale. So without a standard image framework, a potential digital national collection would need to maintain a huge number of custom metadata and service connections between all of the different institutions it was working with. It would need potentially to act as a host for a large number of images that would be presented or sent to them, as I said, with a hard disk in the post, for people to look after for institutions that were not able to publish themselves. So that's a large number of manual connections that would need to be maintained between a huge number of individual institutions and potentially individual researchers and small-scale institutions or schools or universities or people that have collections or information that might feed into what a digital national collection could become. So this is a common problem with data aggregation systems, and it leads to a disconnect between the image source, so the institutions or the researchers, and the presentation. So particularly with the disconnected data example, where someone has sent it, as the work develops in the institutions, there's no direct connection with what people are seeing. And there's a lot of maintenance work for the National Collection. Now, this is, again, the sections that the National Collection would need to be caring about, all of the details and information that they would need to manage. Now, obviously, with the IIIF system, that becomes an awful lot easier. So again, each of the institutions directly publishing their content would go straight in as a IIIF standard and be worked. So any of the institutions would then have their data hosted by a IIIF service. It would just automatically go in and be updated. And researchers do have the opportunity to host IIIF content themselves on many open platforms. And again, this information could just be ingested. So it makes the actual application of generating a national collection realistic and possible at scale. Now, from a more practical point of view, it means that institutions like the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, the V&A, the British Library, the Science Museum Group, or Yale Centre for British Art could all post or publish IIIF content, image information, so the images themselves and metadata about those images, licenses about them, metadata about the objects or collections they display. And that can then be automatically reused within programs like Towards a National Collection, but European projects, Horizon Europe, or other institutions like Europeana, Art UK, Wikipedia, and growing. But you only need to do the job once. So an institution would be able to present and license their images in this way once, and then it'd be able to be used by all of these other systems without any extra work. The same images can also be published under different licenses to create apps. So the same content can be used, but under a different license to create paid for apps. But the other plus is that all of this work can also be used internally for internal documentation systems, for institutions' own public web pages and these sorts of things. So you get an awful lot out from standardizing your image presentation under one collaborative standard format like IIIF. So the project itself, Practical Applications of IIIF, was a collaboration between the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, Edinburgh University and British Library, with project partners of the Royal Botanical Gardens, Digerati, the V&A and Stanford Libraries, the Science Museum Group, and eventually the IIIF Consortium itself as well. Our project webpage is here, and we've been trying to publish all of the content of all of the work that we've done throughout the project. Now, the actual aims of the project was to highlight and demonstrate opportunities and benefits of the IIIF standard, examine the potential of connecting IIIF collections together, exploring the potential existing systems that are out there, and looking at new tools that might be used or new sort of development opportunities that could be explored within the project. So one of the first things we did, which I have sort of presented in more detail before in project webinars and elsewhere, is we created a platform on GitHub. Now, GitHub is an open, free repository where people can develop software, but also can host other information as well. And on GitHub, there is a free process called GitHub Pages where people can create and generate their own websites. Now, obviously, you need some technical skill to do this, but the simple site system, which was created near the start of the project in collaboration with a few other projects, helps automatically generate nicely formatted, responsive web pages to present content. And as far as the IIIF project was concerned, this included automatically adding in IIIF viewers. So researchers could gather together IIIF content from other institutions and present them themselves and tell their own story, in addition to describing the project or whatever they were working on. So this has worked quite well. The system's been used extensively within the project and within other TANK projects and beyond. So it's worked quite well. This is screenshots of the project website itself. I do recommend you go and have a little look. There's some very nice information on there, particularly in the detail of the week and the connected collection blogs that were generated during the project. Now, another way of engaging and demonstrating the opportunities was create webinars. Originally, the project planned a series of smaller workshops, but as a result of COVID, these were all transported online, and we ended up with much larger impact. So across the 4 and now 5 webinars, we had our final webinar on Friday, we've had over 1,000 registrants from over 450 different places around the globe. We've also sort of hosted all of the content from these webinars on Zenodo, and I will come back to Zenodo in a second. And we've had over 1,000 views on there and 740 downloads, in addition to all of the people who've watched these videos on YouTube. So we've had a very good response and a very good connection with a wide audience there. In addition to the GitHub information as I presented before. So as I said, yes, the final presentation was on the 25th of April last week. So we're still working on those presentations. Now, virtually collecting the collections together, the idea was that if you have presented IIIF content and you have that standard, how easy is it to put this information together? So I'm not going to go into this, the demonstrations that I'm going to present here, I'm not going to go into great depth. There is more information on them in the previous webinars and on our website, but it's just to give you a flavor of what we did. So this was connecting collections together and supported by 3 different projects, as is indicated there. What we did is created a system based on that simple site system that I mentioned before. As you can see, the styling is very similar, but it allowed users to use a simple text box to search, in this case, up to 7 collections. Now, we've got 7 different collections around the world with a simple text box. And the system interacts with very complex APIs that are presented by these collections and just pulls out the IIIF information. So if you type in the word C, you get a large number of pictures that have some connection with C. It is a very first step examination of these collections, because obviously if you've got 111,307 responses, that's a bit too much to go for. And if you do a search for flower, you do get 3 million things from the Smithsonian. So there is an awful lot of IIIF content out there that can be explored in this way. And this website gives you the opportunity to dip your toe in and see what's there. Within the project, we have done and been involved in 2 surveys exploring the community and who is using IIIF and the awareness of IIIF within the UK, particularly, and also under what licenses people are releasing content under for UK institutions. And these results are being written up at the moment for publication, but they will be summarized in the final report, which should be coming out soon. But it was asking sort of questions, looking at what people understood about IIIF and what sorts of things they might need in the future. Now, exploring new ideas. So this is the final thing I'll present, is that in addition to the collecting collections together, we've explored 3 other demonstrators, technical demonstrators, one slightly simpler and the other 2 a lot more complex, which I'll give you a brief flavor of here. So one of the things we wanted to do is to look at how we might support existing presentations and publications. So within the National Gallery itself, we had an online system presenting high resolution images to support publications and support exhibitions. So this is something where we're exploring what else you can do with your images. But this was quite an old system. I created it a number of years ago now, and it was getting a little harder to support. So we wanted to move it all to IIIF. So what we have now is a nice simple system that works directly with the standard IIIF. So if you have your content expressed as IIIF manifests, which are groups of images, or collections, which are groups of manifests, this system can automatically organize them and allow you to browse through them in a nice user interface. Again, a responsive interface that works on your mobile phone as well as the web desktop machine. And because the primary focus we were looking at is supporting a publication, in addition to presenting the images themselves, it also actually presented the linked PDF directly at the same time in line with the images. So you could read the paper and look at the zooming image. And this system works directly from the IIIF documents. So there's no database underneath this. It is just the IIIF documents. So it's a very lightweight system. As part of the project, I mentioned Zenodo before. We were looking at Zenodo, which is a free general purpose open repository to store the content we had. And this work actually supported the development of a TANK community. So on Zenodo, you can explore all of the content that's come out of the TANK program, and you can have a little look at it. You end up with a nice DOI for the content you put on. So that's, as an example, the DOI for the web page for our first webinar, Practical Applications of IIIF. But one of the things about Zenodo is it actually uses IIIF to present previews of images. So as part of the project, we had a little look at that. So it's looking at not just one job you can do with images. I have an image, I want to present it on my web page. Exploring the standard of IIIF allows you to look much broader as to how it can actually facilitate multiple jobs at the same time. So we had a very nice collaborative connection with an institute called Data Futures, which is a non-profit in Germany, who are one of the key developers of the software that sits underneath Zenodo. We managed to have a collaboration with them where they did some focused technical development work for us and actually have agreed to host a number of resources for us for the National Portrait Gallery for 5 years now. And this was all an in-kind contribution as part of the collaboration with our project. And what they did is they took the software in Venio RDM that is underneath the data repository. So this is a standard open piece of software that you can create data repositories with for Zenodo, which is backed by CERN. So it's kind of a lot more sort of scientific sort of push at the back. And they created a corpus repository for Tudor paintings for the National Portrait Gallery that people could explore, and it's now public, and presented it with native IIIF content. So the images themselves that are presented in there, as a whole list of different technical images from visible, infrareds, UVs, are all presented with IIIF content. You can zoom in, zoom out of them within the data repository. But the system allowed the National Portrait Gallery to construct custom and bespoke metadata that they wanted to have with their images to demonstrate how a data repository like this could be based on standard software, but provided a tailored approach to corpus repositories for any given domain. The work that we've done with them did extend to discussing how you would then link these corpus repositories together to produce more aggregated searching, but that was beyond the scope of the project we were doing. Now, the final one, and I really can't do this justice because I've just got a couple of minutes left, was to look at a new IIIF manifest editor. Now, a IIIF manifest, as I mentioned before, is one of the core standardized documents in IIIF. It describes a group of images and all of their associated metadata and licensing details. It's written in a format called JSON, and they're a bit complex to look at directly, and you do need technical skills to edit them or create them by hand. So you really need nice user-friendly tools to allow people to interact and create these, which means that anyone sort of who can use a computer can start to engage with the IIIF process. So they can look at pulling in images from other institutions, from themselves, from other researchers, and combine them together to produce their own groups, their own stories, their own research platforms. Now, the manifest editor is being developed by Digirati and is a web-based user-friendly tool to handle and organize these images. It's open source and it's under the MIT license, so people can take the source codes, host it themselves and do what they want with it. So it's an extremely open sort of process that can be exploited moving forward into larger programs such as the National Collection. And we hope the institutions will be able to find it easy to integrate into their own workflows and their own processes to make this much more of a day-to-day job rather than a specialist activity. So instead of a big bunch of text, which I've decided not to show you, you actually get a very nice user interface where this very simple manifest is a single image where you can see thumbnails and zooming images and start to add the required metadata following the instructions and the tools provided for you. So it is in development work and it is ongoing, but there is a working sort of test system now that is being tested as we go along. And it shows an awful lot of promise, and it's going to make this job a lot easier for much wider technical range of skills. All of the code is on GitHub and it's all available for people to work with. So we've been quite consistent within the project to make sure that all of the work that we've done and all of our outputs are available for reuse on GitHub, for exploitation through Zenodo, or hosted on our website, to make it all accessible. Because IIIF, one of the key recommendations, it is a building block. It's not a means to an end. It is not the solution for a national collection. But a national collection that looks at images in any shape or form, it really does need to be one of the core standards used, because the alternative is to spend the next 10 to 15 years creating exactly the same thing again. So at the scale of a national collection, a standard like IIIF and similar standards for other aspects of the metadata we'll need to deal with will be key in the future development of this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. You're actually 2 minutes within time. So thank you very much. I know. I was quite alarmed by your description of all these discs that we're going to be piling up on my spare bed behind me. So I'm delighted that you've come up with a more sustainable solution.
Yeah. Yeah, the usage of standards like IIIF, it's for efficiency and sustainability. It's just very sensible, shall we say.
Great. So any questions for Joe, we'll do after all three presentations. So thank you very much, Joe. And we'll hand the screen over to Natalie Kane.
Okay. Let's see. It's supposed to work. There we go. So this is the project preserving, tiny. Preserving and sharing board digital and hybrid objects from and across the National Collection. Sorry, I'm just going to move this tiny Zoom bar out of the way so I can actually read my presentation. So this project is led by the V&A in collaboration with the British Film Institute and Birkbeck University of London. I'm the principal investigator with my wonderful co-investigators, Dr. Joel McKim, Stephen McConaughey, who's the BFI, the technical co-investigator, Richard Palmer, who's also the V&A, our research fellow, Dr. Gabby Aragoni, and we also had development and preservation expertise from Tom Ensom, who is a digital preservation expert who currently works between Tate but also freelance as well, and it was funded by the wonderful HSC Tech Programme. So the project really is looking at born digital and hybrid objects, which are objects which are themselves digital, so it's not digitized objects or looking at archives in that sense, but more objects which themselves are born digital in their kind of creation and manifestation. So I'm going to go into a little bit more in detail about what objects we use, which might be clearer when we look at the kind of case studies and which objects we selected as part of that. But the key aims really were to lay foundations for future research and develop strategic priorities for the sector, particularly around wider sector and kind of the national collection priorities, to build understandings of the principles, standards, systems, procedures, and literacy required to collect the born digital, and to build confidence and capacity across the sector. Again, this is very much looking at kind of, if we were to collect born digital objects and hybrid objects across the national collection, what standards and procedures do we need to be concentrating on? So obviously, if we are looking to collect these, obviously like any other object, these do function and sit differently. We've found in our research as and have particular things that we need to analyze and expand on, and there's considerable amount of research is needed to really think about these types of objects. So things like software, anything from AR to VR to things which have particular functions, social media platforms, for instance. And again, it's all kind of maybe expand, show you the diversity and the breadth of objects that we kind of looked at. So the outputs of this really were a set of case studies on born digital hybrid objects, so that we could really delve into some of those issues and see what we were really dealing with. A report outlining recommendations for future research and policy for the sector, a decision model for community investigation, which would kind of look at the kind of possible kind of needs and technical constraints that would be needed to acquire this kind of material, and a data model to propose development and expansion of existing cataloguing standards for born digital and hybrid objects. And that was looking at things like CDOC CRM and things like the linked art kind of extension of that. So our case studies where we try to kind of look at 4 things with a particular breadth in mind, but knowing fully well that we wouldn't be kind of completely all-encompassing, and the objects that we acquire, we were looking to kind of hypothetically acquire and look at. So In the Eyes of an Animal was working with the BFI directly, which is by Marshmallow Laser Feast, and that was looking at hybridity. So and the idea of the hybrid object. So it is a VR work that is being speculatively acquired by the BFI, and it's a kind of headset work where you embody essentially a dragonfly or a frog, and it's a VR work that sits on your head but has this physical aspect to it as well as the VR aspect to it. And this really challenged a lot of BFI's collections policies and cataloguing models because of the way that BFI's way of thinking about their collections, but also kind of lent towards some of the thinking around things like collaborative stewardship, like come to in terms of proposing new potential models across the sector for thinking through how national collections might share and think about digital objects. Geist XYZ by Zeitgeist is a entirely kind of computer generated work which sits across multiple objects, and these when we kind of say flexible relationship across acquired parts, it has several different parts, and it's a website, a set of CGI and 3D parts. It also has textual elements to it, has many different parts, and that made us think what would happen if you had these kind of core versus auxiliary parts, what makes up the object, and what different cataloguing models and standards do we have to think about when you're assessing a work. Wise Stop is a app that exists on your phone. It's a work essentially by a community organisation which enables people to record kind of what happens when the police stop and search you, but also enables you to kind of know your rights as well. It takes the form of a wallet card as well as an app. It was really created with the community and tests the idea of oral histories and social testimony in things like app development, and how do you record those things while they're also trying to do something as complicated as digital preservation. And then we have our kind of what we called our speculative case study, which is Instagram, and that really kind of tested us in all of our kind of cataloguing models and acquisition models, because it's a boundless object which mostly tested the kind of corporate models that we've come to understand in the relationship of working with corporate actors, because obviously it's not just a case of identifying the digital object, it's identifying the corporate models that exist around that object and how accessible or inaccessible it is for us to work around things like provenance and collection of policies, but also things like the deed of gift. How do you work with people like Meta to assign ownership and distributed ownership and that kind of thing? So we after that we generated a report, but most of that came from the case studies. We also had a series of 3 workshops with digital preservation experts, cataloguing, collections management experts, a range of different professionals nationally and internationally, where we tested these models against our own literature review, our own press research, and then we kind of put this through to them through a series of workshops that we did. We also conducted a series of kind of more kind of intense expert interviews with 12 people, including industry experts, to ask them kind of what the challenges were of these kind of objects, and that generated this report, which was then released with a webinar on the 20th of January 2022, and that's the first report that we put forward. And some of the things that came out of that was understanding that the born digital and hybrid objects are these multi-part acquisitions that are reliant very much on networks and infrastructures. The mutability of these objects obviously complicates them exponentially. The relationship between context and process and documentation is often very different in how we understand these objects to maybe more conventional objects, and that throws an issue for cataloguing standards in particular. And then the core versus the auxiliary objects. So the core object, so for instance, you might think of a core object being something like a chair. The idea of an auxiliary object, some of the things that might surround around it. So for instance, if you have like a phone, you might have the box that comes around it. But obviously this then changes sometimes with things like software of what that might be. And from that, some of that inspired the work around the data model, which I'll talk about shortly. I appreciate I'm speaking very quickly, but I've got quite a few things to get to. And the new challenges that kind of arose out of that, which became part of the recommendations, were these things like new stakeholders. So something that Annette Decker calls networks of care. So the people that kind of come around these kind of objects that come to care for them. So your DIY communities who kind of resurrect old technology. So my personal obsession is with the Minitel, for instance. You have these great people who are resurrecting the Minitel network from the 1980s to try and bring it back into people's living rooms. But these are often people that are very difficult to work with legally within museums. And how do we kind of create, as a sector, the ability for us to kind of maybe change our collection policies and certain policies to enable the preservation of this. The legal challenges in particular and IPR issues are another thing that came out of this, particularly in terms of big tech heritage, which is something that we're kind of provisionally calling big tech heritage, and gatekeeping around this is another thing that is kind of going to be potentially a challenge to national collections. Authorship and ownership, so distributed ownership and catalog, more particularly around things like IP, again to do with ownership. So for instance, how many people can sign a deed of gift, how many people can assign ownership over to objects, and then challenges to traditional collections and preservation models. So this idea of possibilities for collaborative stewardship of digital objects is another thing that came up quite a few times and is a possibility for recommendations. So there are 10 recommendations that we've given. I'm not going to go into them fully because it could take another 10 minutes, but these are kind of a summary of just a few of them, which is new, the recommendations of the sector for research and policy development. This is not for the National Collection, but we're going to kind of maybe boil these down into some that are more focused for the National Collection. These are more for the kind of sector-wide, which is around new avenues for research and documentation, collection management and curatorial development, opportunities for new value model to support decision making. So this is around financial management and value models in particular. Development of new collecting models around collective stewardship. So for instance, for things like the BFI one that I mentioned, if for instance the BFI policy won't take the hardware element of the acquisition, could they create a new stewardship model that would allow them to work with another institution that could, if it meant that it would ensure the long-term preservation of that VR work, for instance. Further analysis into big tech heritage and legal black holes, working to increase industry cooperation. How would museums do that without reducing, for instance, curatorial autonomy was another conversation that we discussed within the report. An investment into experimental collecting and expanded cultural policy guidance for digital collecting as well. So that's the first part on the first report. I'm going to very quickly talk about the two data models that we talked about that were produced as a result of the project as well. So from the workshops and the case study and the reports, two data models were created. Because I wasn't the author for them, I'm going to try and do them justice because they were created by the brilliant people in my team, which you should definitely talk to if you want to find out more about. So I'm going to try and do them justice and talk about them. So the first one was the decision model, which is created by Stephen McConaughey and Tom Ensign, and it does aim to reflect the workshop discussions and some of the authors, so Stephen and Tom's experience as data preservation and data and information professional experience, to codify the main decision-making processes to step through when assessing a candidate for acquisition. And categorize these into higher level areas and visualize a structured representation of the decision-making flow with termination and escalation flags, and combine them into a multi-part traversable system for use in the real-world assessment of acquisition candidates. This is very much a probing stage, and it's very experimental and questioning, and this is very much meant to be at a point where we know fully well this will not work for every single object. It's meant to be at a point of exploration. This is at a point where we very much want this to be picked up by the community and played with, because when we run this through with our the 6 or 7 people who are very much within the profession to play with, ultimately there were kind of various flags and things that have to work, but this will not work for every digital object, but should be assessed and manipulated as such. So what it is, it looks across, it's a multiple traversable system. I'm going to show you one example from one of the sections that when you go and have a look at it from the report that I'll send the link to, you will see that you jump in and out of them and pull across, but it looks to technical constraints, so infrastructure and content, and how they affect collecting activity, collection policy, so compliance of the object with existing policy, consequence of non-compliance, data protection, issues arising from supply and collection of personal data, intellectual property rights, managing IPR across complex content and infrastructure. So just to give you too long didn't read, structural representation of key decision-making processes when assessing acquisition. And there are limitations as well to this model, obviously, in terms it is very much from a kind of small sample of experience. But essentially this model, you kind of start with your object and you kind of pull it through this model, and it can do anything from, does this require certain documentation? So does the acquisition candidate incorporate any physical objects? Yes, no. And there are these critical issue flags that you can see on the bottom right hand side, which kind of may be a point where it's like, this could compromise or cause an issue for the acquisition of this object, for instance. For sake of time, I'm not going to, but in our webinar, Stephen and Tom do explain it in greater detail, and that is on the Tank website, and you can find it also on our websites, on our B&A page as well, which is the link at the end of it. The second one is relatively new and just been published, so if I again get any of this wrong, this is an area that I'm not super familiar with, but I'm very happy that we have this in because it comes directly out of some of the work we've done around our core and auxiliary cataloguing standards models. So this is Richard Palmer, our technical co-I. This is a flow chart diagram that proposes an expansion and development for existing cataloging standards, such as CRM, Spectrum and CRM Dig for born digital and hybrid objects using the project case studies. This is setting out things like object relationships and workflows, for example, objects based on our case studies. The proposal considers interoperability, such as the linked art profile of CDOC CRM, and was created in consultation and collaboration with the Linked Art editorial board, which we very much appreciate. And then again, this very much proposes, again, a relationship with that, I think I mentioned that core object, auxiliary object, because it's something that we had thought about. So what happens if that core object goes, or what happens if various kind of elements of this object kind of breaks down? So is the object solely used, or how do you understand digital objects differently in terms of cataloging standards? So for instance, on the left, you have this kind of quite simple but quite interesting diagram. So is the object solely used in the final artwork? And you kind of traverse through this just to kind of identify where this works with digital objects. And I'm not going to run through this for the sake of time because I'm aware I'm going to run out soon. But you will find a really a much better breakdown within our report from Richard on this. Just to give you an example of how that works for an object, in the eyes of an animal, the VR work that I mentioned earlier, here's just an example of how those kind of structures work in terms of the conceptual objects and the object itself. But again, I would encourage that you read Richard's documentation of this, because I'm very aware that I'm going to do it justice. But again, we had some really great input from a number of people to help inform the work for this as well. So that is the project. You can find it on the V&A website, and we will be sharing a lot of it that through that there. I think we were published. I think that's just been uploaded at the end of the project, but we're sending the report soon. So thank you. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Like all of you, I've been to many webinars over the last 2 years, and that's the first time I've ever had mossy headsets and vibrating backpacks. So thank you for that, that highlight, and I look forward to people's questions on your presentation later. So thank you, Natalie. Our third speaker, Lora Angelova, we hand over to you.
Hello, hi, thank you so much. Just gonna pop these on and make them full screen. Do let me know if it's not working, but otherwise I will just go straight ahead. Thanks everyone, and great to hear those two updates or summaries of other foundation projects. So I'm going to briefly tell you about Deep Discoveries, which wrapped up about a year ago. So before I get going with the presentation, I would just like to give thanks to all the people who did the actual research on this project. I am not a computer scientist nor a user experience expert, nor an interface designer. So without all the people that you see here, this project could not have gone ahead. So Deep Discoveries was a collaboration between 4 core partners: the National Archives, the University of Surrey, the V&A, and Northumbria University School of Design, who joined us towards the end of the project to help with the interface development and user testing. We also had several project partners, including the Royal Botanic Gardens of Edinburgh, the Gainsborough Weaving Company, the Museum of Domestic Design and Architecture, and Sanderson Design Archive, who provided support and images for our project. So our project was quite short, only about 18 months in total. And what we wanted to achieve really was to explore computer vision similarity search technology and the development of a platform that would demonstrate the benefits of this technology for searching across collections through visual similarity. We also wanted to do some assessment of current users and how they access visual collections, especially keeping in mind computer vision searching and whether users are aware of this kind of technology, what they might want out of it, and how they might interact with it. We also convened workshops, carried out surveys to explore the current methods of searching habits and to gather data on image resource discoverability, and define the requirements for a visual search approach, and also to showcase the technology that we were developing in the project. We also wanted, of course, to raise awareness of this technology in the context of the Towards National Collection program, and to demonstrate how it could benefit cross-collection searching, and to encourage the discovery phase projects to consider incorporating computer vision within their own research. And finally, to produce a final report, which I'll link to at the end of the talk. So what is computer vision search for anyone not aware? This is a method that uses artificial intelligence technologies to allow people to search with images rather than text. So for example, a user can either take a photo or even draw something and submit it to a visual search engine like Google Lens, if you've ever used that one. And the algorithm would identify the objects submitted by the user and return similar items, usually again in the form of images. So visual search is a type of sensory search. It's quite a free way of searching across collections. It allows you to kind of untether yourself from having to know the correct terminology or language to express your search needs. And that way you can really explore just through visual content. So here's an example of computer vision search in action. This website, behance.net, it's used by creatives to showcase their work and therefore contains quite a lot of images. Our partners at the University of Surrey Center for Vision, Speech and Signal Processing worked on the vision search capabilities of the website. So if I select an image like this one that you see here, at the top of the image, you see a little gray button that says more like this. And if we click on that button, we're presented with a number of similar images. And that similarity is based on the kind of pattern, the color, the composition of the original image. But it is relatively media agnostic as well. So you can see at the bottom of the screen, there's a picture of some t-shirts that have the same kind of color and pattern as my original search image. So computer vision really allows users to discover new types of image content, but also to hone in on identical images if that's what they're looking for. So as such, we really thought that this kind of technology would be ideal for cross-collection searching that was being looked at through the TANK program. So the project really began with a literature review and some desk-based research. And all of these findings are presented in our final report, and the data can be found there in the annexes as well. So alongside the literature review, our user research team also carried out a number of interviews, a workshop, and an online survey to understand who the users of visual search might be and what uses they might have for this kind of technology. Few of those users had actually used computer vision search. And of those who had, most of their searching was carried out to find identical images. And this was done for copyright information, to find an image of better quality, or to check on infringement of their own images. creative exploration was carried out, but less frequently. And survey respondents did note that there's some creative uses of the technology. And this was due to sometimes getting unexpected results, which could lead to some discovery type searching. There was flexibility and efficiency when the only search criteria they had available was either an image or a visual theme. And there was also this freedom of needing to articulate visual ideas and concepts that users really liked. However, many of the people we surveyed also noted that the technology was really novel with poor standards and functionality that required a lot of further development. The results that users found were often unexpected or totally irrelevant. Some platforms were not user-friendly and could be overwhelming. And then filtering or faceted searching on things like color, pattern, composition was not at all possible. And users also thought that the metadata they received was not always trustworthy or even rarely available. So overall, our initial UX research team suggested that a computer vision search prototype that we could develop to demonstrate this technology should provide both discovery-driven and research-specific capabilities and guide users in understanding how these operate. The prototype should allow users to articulate their search criteria based on visual facets, but understanding what these visual facets mean to different users was something that was just too big of a question for us to answer within the project. So instead, what we decided is that we could actually try to untether the technology from individual users' defined notions of visual similarity, and to kind of create a pattern that allows users to visualize how the AI finds similarity between their query image and the results image. And then thereafter, the user can actually enter a sort of visual dialogue with the AI and express what within the results images they want the AI to focus on. So we would want to show the user this kind of similarity pattern between their query image and the results image. And at the time of development, our computer science team was able to do this using a heat map. So overlaying your result images with a heat map that showed exactly what part of the image the AI was finding is similar between that and the query image. And then you would be able to kind of visually redirect the AI's attention on a different part of the image if that was your interest. And then you could do this iteratively until you either honed in on a more specific type of image that you were looking for, or broaden out your search by discovering new themes and ideas visually that you hadn't even thought about earlier. An additional option that the computer science team wanted to explore was giving options the ability to redefine and better articulate their search by doing this kind of iterative visual searching on multiple images at once. So this idea meant that the user could select several results images, and within each of those results images, articulate different areas that they were interested in, and then redo the search on that whole new set of images altogether at once. So as you can imagine, all of these functionality options are quite complex to convey to users all at once in a single interface. And especially if we consider that in our initial survey, many users hadn't even explored computer vision at all. So to support this very complex task is we were joined by the team from Northumbria University, who adopted a kind of agile methodology, which also worked really well in our project. And I think that this is another type of recommendation for these kinds of projects that bring together interdisciplinary teams from computer science and the humanities, working with an agile kind of methodology and having concrete prototypes to focus both teams on and to discuss what was possible was really helpful to move the project along and make sure that all of our goals were aligning, and we were able to come up with really interesting designs and questions to ask of our testers at the end of the project. So the Northumbria team explored some different types of themes and user stories as to how users might want to approach this kind of search. And they created several different types of wireframes that we could imagine the prototype looking like. And then eventually they put together an interface design that could be taken by a software developer and created for user testing. So because the prototype is no longer live, I'm just going to walk you through some screenshots of it. But basically, the interface would allow the user to come in and either upload a picture or select one from several options that were presented. And the computer vision search would then return a list of similar images that were ranked in order of similarity. The images that were available for this prototype were quite limited and were just from the collections that I had mentioned at the beginning. So of course, I think if we had like the entire quote unquote national collection, this could be a really interesting exercise. But for the moment, in our basic prototype, the user could then switch to this likeness view, which would overlay the heat map on top of their results images. And then they could see where the AI was finding similarity between the query and the results images. They can then select one of the result images and highlight areas that were more interesting to them and where they would like to refocus the AI's attention. And they could do this on several images at once and then carry out the search all over again on that set of images. So at this stage, we created a static prototype and a live prototype, which we then used for user testing and to gather feedback. And we can ask questions at several different levels here, including the most basic user interface design questions around whether the interface makes sense to users, if they understand what they're doing and how they can actually do it within that interface. We can also ask questions around the effectiveness of the interface. So is it useful as a search engine? Can it be used to conduct helpful searches? And then the higher level research questions as to whether this actually helps users to overcome barriers and search across collections or discover new content or actually focus in on what they were looking for specifically. So we carried this out using an unmoderated static prototype, which allowed users to essentially kind of click through screenshots of the search prototype and do some minor kind of testing, but it wouldn't really allow them to really explore the technology fully. But it allowed us to gather a lot more and faster feedback. So the majority of the unmoderated testing of the prototype showed that respondents agreed that exploring using an image rather than a keyword would be useful for engaging with GLAM collections online. And all users agreed that visual search would be a helpful tool for them. The majority of our testers understood the explainable AI function of the prototype, including the ability to see how the AI saw similarity between the query and the returned images, and also the ability to modify their search criteria based on this information. The ability to select areas within the query and the returned images was seen as user-friendly and helpful. And users found the process of searching with multiple images to be less intuitive, although most agreed that it would be useful and interesting. And several users noted that the selection features on multiple images could create really good opportunities to discover new collections content and new types of collections, as well as to make connections across different cultures or different time periods. We also carried out a series of moderated testing interviews where essentially we had users think out loud as they were clicking through the live prototype and exploring that functionality. So within that moderated testing, users really noted that they struggled to understand the scale of the image collections that they were able to search through. So this was something that was important for users to have conveyed in some sort of easy to process way. And they also wanted to be able to aggregate, curate, and save their own collections of items that they were searching from different institutions in one place. Metadata and reuse permissions were key for all testers, as was the ability to navigate to the collection website from whence the image originated so as to gain some better understanding of the information and context of that image. So we found that testers in our live sessions struggled to really understand the explainable AI technology. All the users found the heat maps to be really confounding, but really fascinating at the same time. So it was really interesting to people because what they thought was similar in their query and the returned images was not at all what the AI was seeing as similar. And I think this really underscores that we each individually have specific ways of finding similarity depending on what we're looking for and what our search task is. And AI might be doing that in a totally different way for that specific search task. So the ability, therefore, to enter in this kind of visual dialogue by modifying the returned images was not picked up so smoothly by the testers. And this could be an issue with our prototype, or it could be an issue with how novel the technology is and how inexperienced users are with it. So we didn't have time within the project to then do iterative testing of this. In any case, it's likely that this kind of development will require a lot more onboarding for uptake, if it or it should be made entirely invisible so that users have a kind of seamless experience of it. And finally, most users intuited both the annotation tool that allowed them to select specific areas within an image to search on, and surprisingly, most of our live users found searching with multiple images to be really easy and intuitive as well. In fact, they mostly mentioned that they rarely approach a visual search with just one single visual element in their minds. Testers were really interested in being able to refine by negative filtering as well. So telling the computer vision search to show them less of a specific type of image. Being able to do mixed searching that included both visual and semantic search. So you have the visual similarity search, but you're also able to then filter on things like media type or time period or location, collecting institution, and then also to be able to have some semantically articulated visually defined facets like color that you could filter on using that semantic term. And our users really highlighted that they had more trust in the images and metadata that would be returned from an institutionally driven visual search platform, and that they liked the lack of commercially driven motivation in the return results. So with that, I will wrap it up. I have some QR codes here that will link you to our final report. Our final event YouTube playlist that was hosted by the Towards a National Collection program is the middle QR code, and this will include talks by our collection user experience researchers, by our interface design team, and of course our computer vision programmers who can explain the actual technological aspects of what they developed. And finally, a little video that walks you through the prototype development by the University of Northumbria. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you for the QR codes at the end. I hope everyone managed to grab those. I've been very steeped recently in our discovery projects, and it's been fantastic this week to remind myself of the brilliant work that happened and is happening in our foundation projects. And I think the three presentations today really illustrated what they managed to achieve with a relatively modest sum of money and a very, very difficult period of time for us all. So it's fantastic to see those results and to see, I'm looking forward to the reports that are still due to come in. So we have plenty of time now for Q&A. So you have various options. You can put your questions in the chat. You can raise your hands, and I think Javier's enabling it. So if we call upon you to ask your own question, you can turn your camera and your mic on, which we always like. We like to be able to meet who's on our calls. So has anybody got a question? Rupert's was a sort of question to the room, and Rupert, you haven't had any responses. So how many people in the room are old enough and wise enough to remember this search? No, poor Laura is too young, too young. Okay, Javier, do you have any questions to start us off and warm everybody up?
Yes, yes, a few. So probably this first one for Laura and Natalie, kind of combined. So this idea of explanatory AI is brand new. I mean, AI is quite brand new, especially in heritage collection. But this idea that we are able now to explain what's happening behind the machine or how the machine is making decisions for users is very new. But I'm wondering, what do you think or foresee is the potential within the pedagogic elements of heritage collections in communicating all this information, not only the computer vision, despite that it was computer vision research, but perhaps all these new tools in AI, natural language processing, entity recognition, so all these different processes in AI and explanatory AI, what is the potential for this within pedagogic environments for heritage organizations? What do you like a very futuristic question, perhaps.
So I can try to speak a little bit to this. Like I said, this is very far from my natural state of knowledge, but I think it's hugely useful and very interesting as to what it can then cover and how quickly it can parse through large amounts of information. Of course, there are you can also get bottlenecked and directed into places that are very biased, of course, and very specific, but I can give you an example from the field I normally work in, which is heritage science, where we kind of analyze the materiality of objects. So for example, if we take a multispectral image of a map, that image, each pixel of that image contains a spectrum that tells us about the actual pigment that was used in that area on the map. So if you can imagine that entire map with all the different colors and lines and everything else that was used, that's a huge amount of information, right? If you want to like parse through each pixel and extract that information. But with AI, you can of course get through that very quickly and then make kind of grouped images that show you, you know, where all the ultramarine was used or where all the Angle ink was used or something like that. And then with vision search, you can actually extract that layer off and very quickly then perhaps using optical character recognition, just get lists of names of rivers or something like that that were written on the map. And so you can then, you know, build huge data sets out of all of the maps that you've imaged, and then researchers can make use of that information very quickly in ways that they would never be able to just by like sitting and looking through each map individually. So I think the potential is like really amazing and huge. And I think the National Gallery even hosted a really awesome conference last week about all of the potentials of these technologies. So maybe even Joe has some ideas he can share with us.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to find the link. I'm just trying to find the link for the. Go ahead, Natalie. I'm just going to try and find the link for that conference for you.
Do you want to comment, Natalie, while he's
No,
searching for that?
I mean, again, I'm not so much involved with the kind of the more technical application and much more on the kind of ethical implications and research applications. But it's, I mean, the work that I tend to do on day-to-day kind of basis is more around sort of the analysis of the data set and what the kind of ethical bias applications are. And so, again, I can't comment much further beyond looking at where, I don't know, the capacity for us to understand. Like, I mean, I've always looked towards things like Emily Pringle's work, the semantics work that she's doing. I think is the kind of what the implications are for that and application to AI. I mean, with our project, it's more looking at if we were to acquire. I think actually there's a project that we're doing in the museum, or acquisitions we're looking at around acquiring machine learning and things like neural kind of technologies. And if we were to acquire that, how would we look at the kind of cataloging standards to that? It's something that we haven't even thought about, because we don't have any of these structures within cataloging really to look at. And actually thinking about some of the work that Richard was doing for the CDOC, expanding the CDOC terms, for instance, like we were quite keen not to use workarounds. We were quite keen to use like the kind of existing stuff that was there and to see like what can we use with what is there to try and expand, rather than to try and completely invent things that were here. Because the idea of the conceptual object, for instance, is something that people kind of it's something that was quite new to me, that we were trying to work through with people that were quite familiar with those standards. And like the idea of the human-made object and the idea of digital information objects, how can they be subverted or thought about through things like machine learning and neural intelligence? And one of the things that I think that we have to think about is and what I'm personally interested in and what we're trying to expand on is the access to this information through things like big tech heritage. And again, a lot of the report that you'll find when you look at our work is more about I don't know, it's the access to how much we can catalogue and how much we are able to do certain things. I don't know if this is a bit more of a woolly thing around the natural practical implications, but I'll let Joe speak.
Okay, I've done a couple of things with AI, but not very much. I mean, one of the things I'm starting to think might be quite interesting is what you've just expressed there, Natalie, about looking at CDOC CRM. And I think as one of the things our project are showing, we were looking at one standard in that project, but the usage of standards is going to be key. But then how you apply standards, particularly more complex standards, can be quite varied. And I think how you will bring in AI to simplify and provide consistency in the application of some complex, particularly ontological standards, I think could be very interesting. So people are starting to work on templates. So instead of looking at the universe as a whole, you think, well, how do I define an object? How do I define an image? How do I define a computer game? How do I? So you could start to see that if someone had a computer game they wanted to talk about, they could be given a sort of structure with empty nodes, as it were, empty little bits that they need to slot in the data that they have, either automatically, semi-automatically. And I think as AI is becoming slightly more accessible, I think we will find a lot of applications within cultural heritage to look at heritage science data. As Laura said, there's a growing interest in that because we're producing more and more of it. But I think it also the language you use and the terms we use and the consistency we have in describing complex systems. I think there is potential for AI to help with that. It'll be very interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely, there's a lot of interesting work around that. I guess the thing that we're kind of almost on the other side, which is like, how do you define AI as a catalogue object, which is kind of the other.
Well, yeah.
And this is where I think that, just to say that I found it very interesting in terms of speaking to Richard and his conversations with the Linked Art editorial board, is like, you have to be like a qualified ontologist essentially to really like go down that road. And I mean, even looking at like the kind of that there is very little kind of standards and work around like the non-definition terms there are for like digital objects. It's quite interesting for us, which is why I kind of in the document I just posted in the chat, there is some sort of the multiple classes and stuff that have been kind of proposed to various objects is quite interesting. And this is why we kind of proposed that model around like the core to auxiliary object, because we understood how multiple and how like the sense of like a digital object isn't just one object, it has multiple parts, and we have to understand it as such. But also to understand that like the fact that there are if you take away one part of the digital object, does it still exist as that object, and does it still have that aspect of that object that we understand? And that's something that came directly out of some of the conversations we'd had with digital conservators, for instance. And this is a consistent model that exists across collections, for instance. So
because I would say that obviously versioning is extremely important there, particularly if you're talking about the versioning of what language structure you use to describe something, or the versioning of the software, the versioning of the AI. Because we're having various conversations in related projects that start to look at if someone makes does future research on the information we present, but the information we're presenting is developing and evolving, ensuring that there's a clear relationship as to what was available when a particular thing happened. So, I mean, we could have various computing systems, and some of them are accessible, some of them are not. But then people make assumptions about what's available or working at the time they read something, as opposed to having a nice clear map as to what the situation was when the work was done.
I mean, we had this conversation from speaking directly to practitioners around the versioning of their work, and that making it difficult to build information architectures around the acquisition of work, for instance. So if like we had this both with speaking to individual practitioners who worked in like VR and AR works around the version history of their work, to kind of people who worked in more corporate settings and the kind of corporate archives of their work. And it's like, okay, so you have these information systems that we have to archive, but then how do they directly conflict with the way that archiving or collection systems work within heritage management systems and like heritage collection management systems? Like we have this real conflict of problems, and this is going to be a huge problem for the like all collections, because we have this move towards some set of standardization, or some set of like, not even standardization, but the idea of what standards are within our sector. But then there's this corporate standardization, which are totally kind of dependent on what people understand as one thing. There's a really great PhD by Avanthia Samaras about this, which we drew from to a degree, which talks about this kind of negotiation of these two sectors within VR and VFX, which is super interesting. But that's something that I think is quite interesting if you're going to be working with like this idea of like what do standards really mean, for instance.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
sorry, that's a little bit of an
Well,
offshoot.
yeah, no, I think it's extremely important. I mean, looking at the concept of a national collection going forward, standards are the things that will make it possible to look at hundreds, if not thousands, of collections connected together, even just within the UK. But yes, it's how a standard is applied. The notion of worked examples is extremely important. And as we were looking at the notion of having a manifest editor, so that people could create these complex documents with just moving thumbnails around and entering text into a box, a similar sort of guiding tools to help you describe complex systems like Bone Digital or AI structures, which go beyond the normal collection attribution systems by a long shot. And I suppose that if you're using knowledge to try and describe the use of it, an application of it, there may well be a conflict to then the description of it as an asset, and how you marry the two of them together. And this is why I'm sort of thinking is, as we've got these standards, if you could end up training AI systems to guide you in doing that, to say that, well, yes, the current national collection approach to defining X is blur, and help you do that.
But you had this interesting thing, particularly with born digital material, and we noticed this from the digital preservation field a lot of the time, where when you go through digital preservation kind of projects more broadly, you have your born digital assets, which are born digital objects. You have your digitized assets, you have your corporate digital assets. They all sit on the same infrastructure and they require the same, often a lot of the same kind of digital preservation requirements, but they have different specific needs and different specific kind of attentions to them. We're literally going through a collections audit at the moment, and we're kind of thinking about, or the process of thinking about this at the moment. And it's like how, like, what are the specific differences that defines like an iPhone software within a digital collection to there's other things that also need the same. But do you kind of know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Where it's like it's not like the same as like having the rest of our collection and then the picture of the collection, they kind of have this different kind of, and maybe that's something where some sort of, I don't know, AI could be interesting to think about.
Well, it's
level of,
yeah,
like,
it's the thought of saying you've got three different paradigms there all connected together, but if you're trying to use a shared language to do it, to have whether a group of people sit there on a VM, on a Zoom meeting to help you and answer questions as you're doing it, or if it's possible to have some kind of artificial intelligence assistance to guide you in consistently doing what you're doing, but allowing you to accommodate those differences, could be helpful. But I don't know.
But I think this is a thing that every collection is going to run into at some point, as every collection starts to have this building of multi-archival or multi-archival as if it like needs. I think it's interesting. But
we're looking.
Sorry,
people in our building department in the National Gallery are looking at creating BIM models of the entire gallery from a facilities point of view. So look at where are the pipes, where are the doorways, what kind of window have you got there? But the same logic is being expressed as to whether you can do exhibitions in the same way, whether you can do frames in the same way, whether you can do. So that's then using a set of language or systems defined for one job, but using it to try and help define and manage collections or even explore collections. But this is conservation science or heritage science, as Laura said before, in general, begs, borrows and steals from absolutely every other domain that could be useful for. So there's always a lot of integration issues and how things apply to our field. It's interesting work, but complicated.
Okay, let me jump in here and just see whether any of our audience have any questions. Have I missed anything in the chat? I don't think so. No specific questions?
No, they just posted loads of links to the
presentation. So anyone in our audience today, you've got some cracking speakers here who can answer anything. So anybody got any questions for them? You just stick your digital hand up or unmute yourself and speak. No? Very quiet today, very quiet today. Any of our speakers got questions for each other on what they've heard today?
Well,
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
I speak too much, so anyone else can go first.
Javier, did you want to come in with a question?
Yeah, I have another one. It's so epic that we're able to have this kind of forums. So, I mean, most of these technologies and most of this research is very high end. So, a lot of small museums, a lot of small heritage organizations, now we can say they're trapped behind all these legacy systems, and perhaps the digital skills are not there yet. So, of course, within IIIF, there's always workshops and the bare minimum recommendations to get started. But so, in order for small heritage organizations, if they need to devise some sort of program or strategy, especially to use IIIF or to be part of this larger ecosystem of tools and digital content, what is the bare minimum that they need?
It depends on your definition of small, because this has come up a number of times in our discussions. As people talk about small to medium institutions, and many of the small institutions have much larger collections than the National Gallery. So it's one of these tricky things. Yeah. So I suppose it's institutions with larger or smaller budgets. Again, it depends on scale. There are a growing number of options for people to host smaller numbers of images. So they can have images up somewhere and make use of them as IIIF content, and allow other people to use them. So the Internet Archive is one that gets used. GitHub can be used to a certain extent to host certain amounts of images. Zenodo, as I said, makes use of IIIF images. Unfortunately, you hit the limiter on how many tiles you can download very quickly. But this is going to be opened up a bit more, as far as I'm aware, when they upgrade their software. So Zenodo or that software may be an option. But it depends on, if you have objects that a few people will look at for research, I think these options will be possible. If you have a collection that is of active interest to the public or to research community at large, to schools or whatever, then some kind of supported paid service is likely to be required. And we've been sort of looking at that this will be needed, or some recommendations or guidance on this will be needed for people to say what's the norm. And this type of institution, I've got this scale of objects, what is the norm? And I suppose as the notion of a national digital collection develops, this type of ability to provide guidance, or at least, direction for people to make those sorts of decisions, will become invaluable, because it saves people's time and money. They don't have to spend 6 months investigating something. They just go, okay, someone else has done, that's how you do it. And if there's one port of call to answer these questions to do with the organization of collection information, the organization of image information, the video, multimedia, born digital objects, then it will be easier. So IIIF, as you said, there are educational options. There are free training materials. There are very good training courses run by the IIIF Consortium. But we've also been considering, and part of the recommendations that we're going to put forward is, I'm sure most of you have heard of the notion of a Wikimedian in residence. That happens quite a lot. So we've been trying to mull the idea of a IIIFian in residence. And whether it would actually make more sense to look at a model with not a single person would go into an institution, but there is somehow a funded group of people who support a wider group of institutions. And whether that's done on a hub process, there's a single point in the UK somewhere, or whether it's done by training local groups of people that support institutions in that area. But that kind of supporting of an infrastructure of knowledge, rather than just an infrastructure of servers, I think is going to be quite key for this to work. Because we can't really be, well, it'd be wonderful if UKRI could fund everybody to learn everything. But in reality, ensuring there are places where questions can be answered by people who have the time and resources to answer those questions, and that is directly part of their remit, could be interesting. The other notion we talked about is whether this could be achieved through a requirement of funding. So if you've received a certain amount of funding to develop your infrastructure, part of a percentage of that is then required to pass on the knowledge and pass on the decisions that have been made to provide support in a similar sort of way. But I think it's a much broader question, but I think additional infrastructure of knowledge will be required to assist that across the sector.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and pertinent, Joe, certainly to how AHRC is thinking about infrastructure at the moment and how integral skills development is to that. But I would have to say you're going to have to find a better term than IIIF.
Yeah, we did discuss that. That just was a non-starter right from the beginning.
I think you need a vibrating backpack. That's what you need. That'll sort you out.
With some moss on it. Yeah.
With some moss on it. Okay, I'm going to draw this to a close if none of our audience have anything else they'd like to ask. I'm not seeing any hands up. No? Okay, so I'd like to thank very much our three speakers, Lora, Natalie and Joe, for an incredibly stimulating afternoon, and our sort of behind the scenes team. Javier's been leading the technical, Cecile's been backing him up, and David's been here as a triple backup in case everything collapsed. So thank you very much to the team for making this happen, and thank you very much for everybody for coming and listening to this very stimulating debate. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.